Nearly exactly 7.5 years ago this evening, I stood on this stage and introduced a program featuring a new book by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who had turned the focus of her reporting on a central figure of her life and, looking inwardly and unflinchingly, crafted an intimate portrait of a life and a relationship. That journalist appeared in conversation on this stage with a consummate professional who anchored their discussion with poise and sophistication. When the program was over, I remarked that those in the audience had been witness to one of the very best book programs that I could imagine. The journalist and author that evening was Lucinda Franks. The book under discussion was My Father's Secret War, and Lucinda's interlocutor was Dan Rather. Now, tonight, we have reassembled the same winning team and welcome Lucinda Franks and Dan Rather back to the museum. This time, we mark the publication of Lucinda Franks' newest book, Timeless Love, Morgenthau and Me. In 2007, in commenting about Lucinda's memoir about her father, I spoke of its depth and honesty and its compellingly human story. I spoke as well of the absorbing hold that the book took on me and about its gradual revelations of deeply personal history. I would use the same words in speaking about Lucinda's newest book. One must admit it can be a tricky enterprise, indeed, to focus a professional reporter's practiced eye on the most intimate spheres of one's own life and the lives of those closest to her. Lucinda Franks manages to do this with a gift for narrative, a refreshing lack of self-consciousness, and a palpable devotion to the man she loves and who loves her deeply, who happens to be the former chairman of this museum, whose name is above the door as you entered this evening, my boss, the boss, Robert M. Morgenthau. Now, I will confess that in reading the book, I learned more about Bob Morgenthau than I ever thought I would. And this evening, I look forward to learning more about this deeply personal and compelling book. And we're pleased, extremely pleased, to welcome Dan Rather back to our stage. As a correspondent and anchor and managing editor of CBS Evening News, Dan Rather covered nearly every important story in the last third of the 20th century, even before that. He brought a rigor and honesty to his reporting that won him the confidence of a generation of Americans who watched him as I did each night. I think it's safe to say that Dan Rather spent more time in my living room than any other person, with the exception of my own family. These days, Dan Rather is the anchor and managing editor of Dan Rather Reports on the cable TV channel Access TV. I can think of no better person to conduct this evening's interview, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Lucinda Franks and Dan Rather.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. And we have a lot of goals here this evening, one of which is we want to have fun and talking about Lucinda's great new book. But I would be remiss, and I think you would agree I'd be remiss, as we start, if we don't pay our respects to the great Robert Morgenthau, who is, if not on every page of the book, is through the book. A great warrior for freedom and democracy. He was in two theaters, Atlantic and Pacific, during World War II. And since then, a great warrior for justice, one of the great district attorneys in the history of the country, never mind of New York City, Robert Morgenthau. Mr. District Attorney, we pay our respects to you. But this is Lucinda's night. I know the District Attorney would agree. Lucinda, Timeless turns out to be not only a very good read, but a deep book. It's been advertised, and we all understand why this is the case, as a love story. But anybody who's delved into it recognizes it's much more than that. It is a book, it is a love story. It's a lot about marriage, how to make a marriage work, how to get through the tough times of marriage. But it's also about history, political history of New York City, political history of our own beloved United States of America. It's about terrorism, 9/11, behind the scenes, back behind the cloak of what it's like, what it's really like to be a district attorney in the pre and post 9/11 eras. It is all of those things. Having said that, what do you want the reader to take away from the book more than any other one thing?
I think that what to me at the end of the book was most important was that Bob and I, we stuck together, and we didn't abandon each other. We didn't, because of a month of arguments or a bad year, turn our noses the other way. We kept reinventing things. And in the book, we come across a man who totally changes our view of each other, because he sees me as someone that Bob knew when he first married me. So he laughed at my jokes, he took pictures of me, and he made Bob feel like he was a young $1 million person. And after Frankie had left us, we met him in Portugal, we just had a new view of each other. And I think this is what you have to keep doing, is finding ways not to work at, marriage, but finding ways to reinvent what you have.
What was the worst day of the marriage? Listen, nobody gets through it unscathed. Any of us who've ever been married know that very well.
I think one of the worst days was when I couldn't convince Bob that the CIA had inadvertently been complicit in 9/11. I had done a lot of research. I'd even found in my research a quote from Bob in New York Magazine saying, "The CIA and the FBI have not cooperated with the law enforcement community, and if anything led to the 1993 bombing, it was them." So when I confronted him with this quote, he said, "I don't remember saying that. Bob doesn't like to look back. That's what makes him a great district attorney." And he had trouble keeping in his mind that, our intelligence agencies were in bed with terrorists who were their informants and who were also committing, crimes of bombing and whatever. So he finally did admit it, but it took a long time for me to convince him that the research I had done pointed to the involvement of the intelligence.
Well, I will say that among the more surprising portions of the book, and also the most interesting, among the more interesting to me personally, was this area, discussing, looking back, the FBI, CIA, what they might have done, could have done, should have done. But I'm going to ask the companion question, having asked you what was the worst day of the marriage, and the best day of the marriage, or the best time of it.
After our first child was born,